Welcome to Stories After Midnight. Today we're going to be reading part 3 of our Lab Rat series written by Trash Tia. This part's called 3 Years Ago, I Was a Research Student Working on a Remote Island. We were out of lab rats, so our professor used us instead. Introducing Teleportation. So I appreciate you for being here. A huge shout out to my Patreon members for helping make this episode possible. Let's get started. Teleportation, or plunging, and psychokinesis are real. I am proof of that. Thanks to the brutal experiments myself and my colleagues have been put through, I no longer consider us human. July 2020. I want to start this post telling you how I woke up face down in the shallows my blood diffusing water was half submerged in. I was part static nothing, and part flesh, pieces of skin caught between my new teeth and a sour taste in my mouth. Honestly, it would be easier for me to get right into it and detail the horrific testing which has messed with my head, taking away my humanity. First, I have to tell you about plunging. If I had to describe it in technical terms, or at least what I can think of from the top of my head, I would say it's like being caught in a nuclear explosion coming from within your own body. 1 minute I was clutching a motionless Kion for dear life. The next, swamped in glistening wave-like light as the plunge sucked all reality from the hotel room, ripping my colleague from my grasp. I remember being fully aware of his body splintering into glistening atoms, floating in the air like glitter, and the childish part of me, which was almost high from this sensation, wanted to laugh and envelop my hands in Kion's remnants. It would later be referred to as our backseat residue, but at that point I just saw it as stuff, glitter, snow, tiny water droplets. Before I knew it though, I was next. I didn't exactly feel my own body be swallowed up initially. When talking about it with my therapist, I described the sensation as imploding inside myself. Like a black hole it appeared within me and was slowly disemboweling my being. The next moment I was nothing. I was nothing. And I belonged to nothing. I've always wondered what oblivion feels like. As a kid, I looked into the night sky and wondered just how vast it was, and how many stars there were. The plunge was my answer. Plunging was like being thrust into a whole different oblivion, where nothing was real, only you in that moment. Time does not exist. Light and dark does not exist. There was only pain like I had never felt before. It was excruciating, agony. The feeling of every bone snapping in two and shattering into atoms. Organs bursting, imploding, and coming together and falling apart. Everything inside me shattering into a black hole, until I was nothing but matter with barely a consciousness clinging on. I can't fully describe what plunging meant for my body without going mad. I can tell you what I saw in the initial experiments with rabbits, which is essentially what happened to us. Plunging, also teleportation, was not stable in any subject, causing each of them to rupture and come apart as soon as the plunge began. As a researcher, I watched this happen. I watched the first subjects immediately reject the plunge and explode on impact. With following subjects, it seemed to be getting better, almost like the phenomenon itself was learning. After losing half of our subjects, we did get hints that it was starting to work, but not the way you would think. We got results, of course, but these results weren't exactly promising. Yes, plunging, also teleportation, was possible, except only certain parts of the rabbits were being transferred from the primary location to the destination. So instead of getting fully whole rabbits at the receiving end, there were only gory, fleshy chunks and heads with no eyes. The plunge did not just tear them apart physically, it altered them in ways neither of us could begin to understand. They would come back with 2 or 3 of them merged together, eyes missing, tongues longer, sometimes entirely inside-out missing vital pieces. Not just physically either. Some rabbits who were mostly whole would try and bite us and grow erratic, climbing the metal prongs of their cage. We did, however, end up succeeding once the serum was modified and injected into a half-dead subject. Professor Quincy had learned that the serum didn't seem to work on a live subject. It was only when the subject was dead or dying when the serum kicked in. With the 4 survivors of the plunging experiments, we began tests to measure how far they could teleport and their reaction times. Each of them had a safe place where their mind would take them during plunging to protect them. which would usually be the cage they were initially brought in, or certain parts of the laboratory where they experienced the best treatment. Jem used to feed them carrot sticks, so 3 out of 4 of them saw their safe place to be where Jem usually stood. There were significant changes with the subjects. After the first successful plunge, however, for those already inhabiting blossoming psychokinetic abilities, these rabbits stopped fighting the serum altogether and seemed to submit to Quincy's torture. Before surgery, they would squirm and bite and have to be sedated before testing, but after plunging, they seemed to lose all of their fight altogether. Their brainwaves were significantly different and they stopped eating. Kion remarked that it was like having zombie rabbits, and I had to agree. They may have been alive, after being brought back to life repeatedly through surgery and scrambling their brains, but plunging had awakened something inside of them, something irreversible, that I pretended not to see. Because if I stopped to look properly, switching on my humanity against my professor's orders, then I would have realized we had created monsters we were in denial of, monsters who were slowly gaining sentience and developing a significant taste. I hadn't forgotten when a rabbit sent an orderly crashing into the wall with its mind. Now imagine that, but this time in humans. I had no idea just how similar and yet drastically different it would be in human subjects. I already knew it would hurt. I had to turn away during our initial testing on animal subjects because they screamed. Even without the ability to cry and scream like a human, I still heard it in their squeaking and their crying. And this is why we were told to turn our backs on being human and moral and good people. That was until the same thing was happening to us. At this point, I had already experienced plunging. However small the test was, and despite not being myself during it, my colleagues and I were the first human experiment subjects to successfully plunge. And that was April 2020. That was when our professor might have had the slightest semblance of humanity clinging on, before he began to subject us to far crueler experiments far beyond what the rabbits went through. In my last part, I detailed the fact that Kion was messed up beyond repair due to what has been done to him, and in this post, I will elaborate on what exactly happened to us before I can go into the experiments that started everything. However, I will begin in July 2020. Exactly half a second, it felt like half a second, after plunging from the hotel room, being torn away from my colleagues and splintering into several singularities, ripped apart again and again and again, until part of me, the conscious part of me, found my safe place, like the rabbits. During trauma, which their minds cannot comprehend, humans will find their safe place, and mine was the shallows on the beach by the lab. I had always dreamed about it during captivity. It was the closest to home. If I imagined myself standing ankle deep on the very edge of the shallows and staring across the glistening blue ocean, I could delude myself into believing one single step would take me home and free me from the endless hell I was being forced to endure. We all had our own safe places once Quincy officially declared us as successes. Riss's was behind the door in the lab by the communal area where she spent most of her time as a human. Kion's was in the hallway where he could see the sun and the wide expanse of blue sky. And Jem's was in storage with the rabbit cages where he would sneak in as a human to either feed them carrot sticks or open their cages and cradle them to sleep, despite being told multiple times not to grow an attachment to the subjects. After being swallowed up by Kion and Riss's collective energies combined, creating a plunge powerful enough to rip away reality in that room, I found myself exactly where I wanted to be. I was at the beach, to be specific, right near the coves where my colleagues and I used to have picnics and paddle in bioluminescent plankton as humans. Plunging didn't exactly give me an option how I would land, and if I would make an impact in the physical plane at all, I was nothing, just scattered atoms, an outline of a human figure with enough physical elements to allow me to stumble and stagger, tumbling through folds of energy glittering in the air, crackling with power. It's like walking in the air, except you don't have legs or arms, or even a body. You're just there as atoms, slowly being pieced back together again. Reality does not like plunging. Every time one of us slips through, the ground rumbles like Mother Nature herself is screaming at us to stop. After several attempts to land and then finally slamming into damp sand, I struggled to get a hold of myself and my body. I was whole, mostly. Once my senses were back, I had a semblance of myself. I could hear the soft waves crashing into the shore. I depressed my face into the sand, waiting for my right eye to grow back, but already my body was working against me. I knew what came next. After my flesh grew back, stitching itself back onto my bones, static energy becoming blood and bone and muscle, I would begin the hunt. You see, when humans burn up a colossal amount of energy, they need to find a way to get it back via nutrients. Plunging was essentially being ripped apart and put back together, creating a whole new body. And I was hungry. I was so hungry, once the palm of my hands were physical enough to feel, I bit into them, tearing into my own flesh. I can't remember much of it. It's like a dream. I waited until I was no longer glittering particles and static body parts before jumping to my feet. The man was local and easy to find. I didn't have to do much. I think he was listening to music, completely oblivious of my presence. It took 2 strides for me to grab him, snap his neck, and sink my teeth into his flesh, tearing it from his bones until I was satisfied. I was never satisfied. There was never enough human flesh to find, and I couldn't control myself. After plunging, we developed an insatiable hunger, which drove me mad until I ate something. In the lab, we were force-fed every food imaginable, but nothing really stuck until Quincy started feeding us pieces of locals. They tasted like salt, but the good kind. The kind which quenched that itching and relentless burning in the back of my throat. Professor Quincy called it a mistake he could fix, though I knew even he was completely stumped on why these instincts were awakened inside of us. Looking back, I know it was intentional. The guy intended to turn us into monsters, into freaks he could put on a leash and parade around like the freaks we were. Back then, though, part of me wanted to believe he could fix that so-called mistake. I want to tell you I was in a trance while feeding and that I couldn't help it. That part is true. Though I was fully conscious throughout, and no matter what I tried to do, stop my own bloody hands tearing skin off of bones and plunging into glistening gore, I had no control over myself. I was halfway through the man, chewing my way through his guts when the fog lifted from my eyes. Like I was in a trance. I awoke, feeling sick to my stomach and shaky. My immediate reaction was to purge what I'd eaten, but I didn't have time for that. Throwing the man into the sea, my first thought was to go back to the lab for the others before it hit me that I was outside for the first time in 6 months. I was actually free. I didn't have people around me, or an electric collar around my neck forcing me to stay where I was. Looking down at myself, I was covered, painted in the man's blood. It splattered my mouth and chin, and the taste and stink of human blood made me want to gag. The sky was black. Nighttime. It was so peaceful, and as I slowly waded into the shallows to wash myself down, I couldn't stop thinking about the dead man's family who had no idea of their loss. Dizzy, barely conscious, and struggling in my new body, I was half considering diving into the ocean and swimming out to where the sea collided with oblivion, when I glimpsed something floating several feet away. When I started towards it, I realized it wasn't floating, and not a something. It was a someone. I only needed to see dark brown hair and the familiar pale blue of the hospital gown we had been forced to wear to know it was Kion. My colleague was curled up in a cove, soft waves pushing him closer to shore. When I knelt next to him and reached out, grazing my fingers over his arms, he wasn't fully formed yet. He was close, but his skin was still slowly knitting itself back together, taking its time sketching out his eyes, nose, and mouth in strokes of unearthly, blinding light. I once saw it in a rabbit, this process, and I remember describing it as beautiful, like God himself was creating living things once again. I watched the rabbit start as nothing, but particles in the air, blossoming into an outline, growing thicker, growing flesh and fur. It's weird being both an ex-researcher and a subject. I got to witness and document it, only to experience it months later. But seeing it with Kion and knowing the same thing happened to me, it turned my gut knowing I wasn't seeing his original body. Kion's original body had been lost during the first plunge, and so had mine. I found myself wondering with every plunge, and every time the universe copied us into existence, were we losing more and more of ourselves? Touching him was like enveloping my fingers in static, or maybe stars. It looked like he was glitching, half real and half not. I waited until he was physical enough for me to wrap my arms around him, lifting him and holding him to my chest. I could already sense a heartbeat, as well as his familiar energy enveloping him. If he wanted to, and if he was awake, my colleague could have sent me hurtling into the sea with one flick of his wrist. From how he had been acting pre-plunge, I had no doubt he wasn't going to do that. Kion hadn't plunged, thanks to me snapping his neck before the two of us were swallowed up. So, while Riss and I had been through the brunt of it, our third colleague had just been a passenger with me. Kion wasn't as heavy as I initially thought. I figured with his body coming back together, there would be added weight, but it was like carrying a feather. Stumbling back onto the shore with my colleague's head sandwiched against my chest, I felt relief for the first time. "Hey, Kion." Jolting my arms, I allowed myself to smile, pointedly ignoring my gory hands clutching my colleague for dear life. Riss's safe place was at the lab, so I had no doubt she was there, and getting her back was going to be a problem. "Are you awake?" I held my breath. "Don't kill me, okay? I had to." He responded with a grunt, which was enough for me to let out a breath of relief. I hadn't forgotten that he had disemboweled a fully grown man with his mind and outright told me he liked to plunge. That was something I was pushing to the back of my head, though. For once I wanted to focus on the cool night air grazing my skin, a slight breeze playing with my hair. Kion didn't answer, but I knew he was awake. His breathing had quickened, and I could feel his breath against my skin. "Chill out," I murmured, aware of his body seizing up. "Happy birthday, okay? I want you to sing it in your head 3 times. His hand shot out, and I panicked for a moment, thinking he was going to send me careening into the air. Instead, though, he just signed, "No." "Why?" "Because." His hands were struggling with signing, and my chest ached. Still the same old Kion, and yet also drastically different. "Because no." Stubborn bastard. I rolled my eyes, enjoying the feeling of sand between my toes. God, I had dreamed about it. "Your loss," I told Kion. "If you plunge, I'm letting go of you, and I won't hesitate dropping you in the sea." I found myself smiling. I hadn't smiled in so long. God, it felt good. Ignoring his protests, I strode into the shallows once again, allowing each wave to wash over my ankles. The plankton was faded, but definitely noticeable. My memories were still unstable and not quite right from the experiments, but I did remember pieces of our time before being subjects. I remembered lying back on the sand under a full moon, while Riss and Jem splashed around like little kids. Kion bringing out his telescope to map out constellations. I doubted his state of mind cared about stuff like that anymore, which was a painful realization. All he cared about was bodying people with his messed up mind. My colleague didn't speak for a while, and I enjoyed the silence. After what felt like hours of staring at the sky, a thought came over me. "Have you eaten?" I signed awkwardly with my hands. "No." Regardless of plunging or not, both of us needed to find food before our bodies took control of our minds. "Are you hungry?" He hesitated before signing. "I'm hungry for food." "Liar, do you want me to let you go?" He twisted around to glare at me. "I'm barely conscious." "Well, maybe the sea will wake you up." I thought he was going to sign something insulting, but instead my colleague's body jerked, and I sensed his animal instincts bleeding into fruition. That was when the Kion I was scared of, who sensed someone coming, and his immediate reaction was to blow their brain to pieces. It wasn't a stranger, though. I could already sense their familiarity and their scent. My body, however, was already going into panic mode, which triggered plunging. The force of each step towards us felt like a tidal wave of heat. I could sense Kion trying to use his ability, but he was too weak. So was I. Even after eating, I had to sleep and rest my new body before I could even think about burning myself up again with plunging. Still, though, I could sense a threat, which had my toes curling, a sour bile creeping its way up my throat. When the sleek metal butt of a Glock protruded into the back of my head, I knew there was nobody holding it. The air was suddenly suffocating, and at the corner of my eye I could glimpse a flicker of light, sparking in the air. I could feel it once again, stripping at the sand beneath my feet and playing with the ocean. Kion didn't move, but his skin was already scalding hot. If I concentrated, the air in front of me was starting to spark and ignite with his ability. "Run," I thought hysterically. The gun hung in the air around me like a tease, before finding my right and then left temple. If I concentrated, I could sense his pressure on the trigger. Down. The voice slicing through the air sent shivers through me, and Kion let out a sharp hiss. The word had weight to it, and my body instantly reacted to it, automatically submitting. When he repeated it, I did what he said and dropped to my knees. The gun followed me, grazing across the back of my skull like it thrilled him to see us helpless. If I could figure out where exactly he was without twisting around, I should have been able to at least stall him by sending him flying into the shallows. Like he had read my mind, however, his palmy hands were coming down to squeeze my shoulders, and I was reminded what Seth had taken us away from. Being sold as guard dogs was one thing, but being put on auction to become guinea pigs for the world's elite and top scientists was something I couldn't even comprehend. I had the ability to pop the guy's brains, and I couldn't. Behind me, I glimpsed a van awaiting us, and from the static electricity crackling in the air, our fourth colleague had been caught. Bastard, Kion gritted through his teeth. It was rare when he spoke. I don't think I'd ever heard him speak. Only when he was begging the professor to stop us from plunging in the initial trials, when he'd lost the ability to use his hands. He weakly lifted his arm, which I knew was going to cause damage, being the most powerful out of all of us. And, well, as the one who was most in touch with this psychokinetic ability, mixed with the fact that his brain was scrambled from relentless torture, made Kion the most dangerous and unpredictable. After plunging, though, he was as weak as any other normal human. Like me, he needed to eat before he could attack. His whole body jolted, his wrist snapping with a sound which sent my gut into my throat. When my colleague let out a guttural cry, I gave up. What was the point in fighting? I could sense that little furry bastard at our attacker's side. 15. All right, guys. Jem stabbed the gun into the back of my head once again, and this time I dropped Kion, who crumpled to the ground. He didn't try to get up, and I knew why. Unfortunately, my colleague had a weakness, and despite being stripped of his humanity, Kion still had that weakness. Jem's monotone voice was worse than that he was using his ability against us. Another rough crack of the gun sending me to my feet, just like what 15 had done to his brain. Twisting and warping it into submission, he was doing the exact same to us. His next words dragged the breath from my lungs, and I wanted to scream. He spoke like we had a choice, like the laboratory was our solace. Let's go home. April 2020. The memories started out like a breath of fresh air. I was back home on campus, far away from the island. I was back to civilization, back to late-night Starbucks and bus rides which made me nauseous. Even the sight of traffic, which usually pissed me off, filled me with the kind of joy I thought I'd lost. It was just a typical day before I scored the researcher job with Professor Quincy, late 2019. I saw dogs on the street and ducked to pet them, scrolled through Instagram and read way too many news articles to and from campus. Though, as soon as I was starting to sink into my own private solace, imagining my parents in my home, I was being thrust into a memory which crept up on me, eliciting a shiver down my spine. It was night, and I was on campus. I was never on campus after work hours. As a recent graduate, I had only managed to slide into a temporary researcher position with a professor I had forgotten the name of. Not exactly what I wanted to be doing with my life, but it was a job and something I was good at. The corridor was pitch black, partially illuminated by the flashlight on my phone. There was a $20 note squeezed in my fist, and every so often, I would jump on the heels of my feet to keep myself warm. I was seriously regretting choosing cash over potentially losing my job. Kion Saying was probably the smartest in our graduating class and already lined up for a top researcher job at an exclusive university. But he was still a trust fund kid, and I was going to take full advantage of that. There was a line, though, and standing outside to keep lookout for lingering professors and night guards while he and his friends snooped our professor's office was definitely crossing it. Kion told me they would be 10 minutes, and I'd been standing there for way over half an hour, scrunching the 20 he gave me tighter and tighter in my fist, when my phone vibrated with a text from my housemate. I ignored it. It's not like I was against breaking in. I was curious to know what exactly our professor had been working on. But did they have to do this stuff at night? Minutes passed. 5 minutes. Then 10. I was straightening up with the intention to just leave them and head home when a shadow loomed behind me, and a shriek built in my throat. When my flashlight beam revealed a familiar face, however, I resisted the urge to shove him. Illuminated in blinding light which hurt my eyes, Kion Saying held up a hand, a sign. 5 minutes. His lips quirked into a scowl, and I would have gotten pissed at him if I weren't transfixed by the way the light seemed to set every strand of his hair on fire. What is it? he signed, looking over my shoulder, his eyes widening. Did you see anyone? I shook my head. No, but I want another 20. He cocked his head. Relax. Another 20 or I'm going. I'm not your lookout for free, you know. Kion hesitated before pressing another 20 in my hand before signing. You're the worst. It's a hustle, baby. Nodding slowly, the guy gave me an odd look, and I remembered why he didn't like me. I definitely wasn't subtle with my flirting. Just stay here. That's what Kion said. 5 minutes. After another 20, I was fidgeting, jumping up and down, every sound causing my head to snap around. That was it. Hey, what's taking you so long? Ducking into Quincy's office, I found myself in what felt like a modern reenactment of Scooby-Doo. My classmates surrounding my professor's laptop, each of them brandishing their own flashlight. Jem Littlewood in the center, his gaze glued to the laptop screen with Kion over his shoulder. Rhys Claremont busy turning the office upside down, searching through books and files, making a significant mess, and 2 others I couldn't fully name. They had joined our class late in the semester and barely graduated, though. I was sure one of them was called Tom. When I was stringing sentences together in my head, trying to figure out how to ask what the hell they were doing, when Jem hissed out, stabbing the screen. Here it is! He lifted his gaze and met his eyes with me. Jem's eyes were dark. He wasn't smiling. He looked kind of sick. I knew it! Jem poked at the screen again, stabbing at it until Rhys hissed at him. I knew this guy was shady! Intrigued, I stepped closer. What did you find? Kion's eyes left the screen momentarily to glare at me, and I fingered the 20 in my pocket. So much for the takeout I'd been planning. Human experimentation, Rhys said, leaning on the desk. In her hand was a leather-bound file. It's all in here. Not just humans. Jem curled his lip in disgust. He's been mercilessly murdering rabbits. These little guys can't even defend themselves, and look at this. He turned the screen to show me, and I glimpsed a printed image of what was left of a rabbit lying in chunks on the ground. I had to swallow my dinner, which had snaked its way back up my throat in a sour paste. Luckily, Rhys was quick to explain. She waved the folder in the air. A glimpse into the ability to awaken the mind of the extraordinary, she started to read. Can we as humans push ourselves to lengths greater than man has achieved? Rhys had always been the level-headed one in the group, but even Rhys was struggling to comprehend what she was reading. It's talking about taking apart the human brain and stitching it back together with some kind of theoretical serum, she explained. Quincy outlines that he's working on said serum, but the subjects keep rejecting his advances? They're failing, and he doesn't know why, she laughed. He's basing research on fiction, essentially. This serum isn't possible outside of Marvel movies because... Rhys was flipping through pages, her expression growing wilder and wilder. Psychokinesis? Teleportation? Superpowers. Jem, who was sitting in the spinning chair, did a dramatic twirl. This guy is trying to find superpowers in rabbits. He paused, his wandering eyes going back to the light of the MacBook screen. Through some pretty messed up stuff. This is torture. Look at this. He's hurting them. And these little guys can't fight back. He's injecting that serum or whatever it is into them and trying to find something that doesn't exist. His eyes found mine, and for the first time I was terrified of my professor. He's a psycho, Jem spat, nodding at the screen. This is all we need to show the police, and surely they'll shut him down. Here he goes. Tom's voice sounded, but I couldn't see him. Like my memory was trying to hide him. All I sensed was a shadow looming in the corner. The animal whisperer. Professor Psycho is cutting into people's brains, and Dr. Doolittle here wants to save the rabbits. Jem's cheeks blazed, his head snapping up. What, and they don't deserve rights? Tom chuckled. You know, I've heard rabbit stew is tasty, man. You should try it. You're hilarious. Why are you even here, Tom? Duh. Professor Freakshow is doing weird stuff and I want in on it. Just like you. Tom cleared his throat. Or are you just here to save your furry friends? When Jem jumped up from the chair, always a loose cannon, Rhys shoved him back down. Cool it, Kion signed. Tom, stop being a douche. He nodded to Rhys, who held up pieces of paper with scary red ink printed all over them. And look at this. None of this is on campus. This guy's got a secret lab somewhere, and from the look of it, They have all failed. Look! She held up another leather folder. This guy's pissed off a lot of people. He's in debt with pretty much everyone in the medical field. Kion nodded, leaning over Jem, his eyes stuck to the screen. Wait, he signed, drawing our attention back to the laptop. What's that? What's what? Jem's expression crumpled with confusion, and Riss followed Kion's gaze, her eyes widening. There, she pointed. Go back onto the desktop. No, not that one, she nudged him. Do you know how to use a MacBook? Riss groaned. Yes, under that folder. At this point, I was edging closer to them, unable to resist my own curiosity. There was a moment of silence, the three of them intensely frowning at the screen, and Jem moving the mouse at record speed in twitchy movements, before Riss let out an audible cry, her hands slapping over her mouth. Turn it off! She shrieked, and Jem, who looked startled himself, leaned back in the chair with panicked eyes. His gaze snapped to the door. Ren, can you watch the hallway? Something ice-cold slithered down my spine, and I nodded, all of the breath sucked from my lungs. Yeah, I said, but I wasn't heading towards the door. My body had a mind of its own, getting closer and closer to the desk where Jem was almost comically stabbing buttons and fighting with the mouse to exit whatever he'd managed to open. I thought it was an alarm, but looking at Kion's eyes, who was staring at the screen, there was something they were watching. Jem, looking sick to his stomach and Riss peeking between her hands. Instead of stepping out of the office to be the lookout, I found myself leaning over the desk. Jem had given up trying to turn it off, instead frowning at it like he was in a trance. And I didn't blame him. I started forwards, the screen in front of me coming into view. What I could see were 4 people in lab coats, with our faces. We surrounded a bed, where a woman was kicking and screaming. I recognized myself as I held her down, administering something inside an IV which calmed her down. Before her body went still, her arms going limp. I stepped forward and made an incision in her stomach, the 4 of us carefully opening her up and removing each of her organs, placing them in a white container. It wasn't the procedure itself which turned my gut. It was that we emptied her out completely with no expression, no glint of humanity in our eyes. I was transfixed by myself, the way I moved, like I was a puppet on strings when Jem clicked off the video finally, leaving us in an awkward silence. It was the perfect time to run, to get out of there, though part of me wanted to know the origin of the video and just how exactly my professor had managed to film something I didn't remember. Jem's fingers tapped at the mouse, and I could sense him starting to freak out. That's not us, right? He looked at me for confirmation like I would know, and I saw the panic starting to twitch in his lips. What is this? Blackmail? Jem leaned on his fist and turned next to him. Riss peeled her hands from her face, letting out a breath. Kion, who had been quietly observing, nodded. It's blackmail, he signed. My guess is he wants us for something. He leaned against a bookcase. Question is, what? I told you, that's not me, Jem gritted out, straightening in the chair. That's a deepfake. No, that's us, Riss spoke up, signing simultaneously. Sorry to burst your bubble, but it's not possible to create a deepfake as accurate as that. He would need some serious technology, and Professor Quincy doesn't exactly strike me as a techie guy. She held up the documents she'd been clinging onto. Remember the class we had a few years ago about the theoretical idea of suggestion? He was always bringing it into discussion, right? Almost like he was obsessed with it. Well, Riss slammed the documents down on the desk, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. What if he wasn't talking in theory? We all know it's possible. MK Ultra, mind control. It's not out of the whim of possibility that our unhinged professor managed to get his hands on certain tools, which could make the power of suggestion no longer a myth. Something more realistic. When even Kion frowned at her dismissively, Riss shrugged. I'm just saying, we just watched a 2-minute video of the 4 of us murdering a woman and removing her organs. And apart from the shock value, none of us seemed deeply affected, which means deep down we already know we've done it. Riss prodded at her own temples, and I was suddenly all too aware of how right she was. I was horrified by the video, yes, but part of me was already desensitized. Looks like our professor has been messing with our heads. Kion started to sign, but she turned to him. Do you remember what you did Monday night? His frown told me everything I needed to know. Exactly. To further her point, Riss turned to each of us. Any of you? I thought I passed out and lost several hours, but what if that wasn't the case? Jem folded his arms. That's not possible, and you're starting to sound like a conspiracy theorist. No, I think, just like Kion said, he's made the perfect blackmail video. Footsteps outside suddenly sent my body into fight or flight, and Kion shot me a dirty look. You were supposed to wait outside. Before I could answer, a shadow loomed in the doorway, but I never saw it. Instead, my mind plunged me into another memory. A flash, and I saw Sarah and Tom wrapped in plastic. My own hands were bloody and streaked red. I threw them into darkness of the failure room and turned to see my professor's face. Very good, Ren, he said. Don't worry. There are successes and failures. Sarah and Tom weren't strong. His hands were on my shoulders, and the feeling of his grasp on me felt familiar. Warm. What did I say, Ren? Word for word. That they are not to be considered as human, I said, my voice a monotone drawl. Sarah and Tom are subjects of the mildew experiment. Precisely, he said. His hands squeezed my shoulders. I see a lot of myself in you, Ren. Conflicting morals and a state of mind begging the question, are we good people? As scientists, no, we are not. Humans, debatable. You will soon understand the lengths I am going to will benefit humankind. I want you to be on that journey with me. All of you. I believe you will become stepping stones to the new age of man. Yes, Professor Quincy. I didn't remember any of that. So why did I know the feeling of warm blood on my hands and spattered up and down my arms? Why did I know the sensation of my scalpel slicing through a human arm, human flesh? Sarah, why did I know the exact weight of her in my arms and where to dispose of her body? The trauma of that specific memory being dug up was enough to jolt my brain into awareness, reality blooming. I awoke with foggy thoughts, staring real hard at a white ceiling. I couldn't move. My body was stiff and it didn't feel like mine, like I was a phantom barely clinging on. Through half-lidded eyes I just managed to force open, I glimpsed clinical white. There was just white, a large expanse of white, and enveloping the white was a figure looming over me speaking in tongues, and I had to really concentrate to figure out what they were saying. It took me a while to figure out it was the radio. It was a newscaster, the voice crackling into my ears just as a thunderbolt of pain racked the back of my skull. Good afternoon. It is April 3rd, 2020. The WHO have announced today new curbs to combat the novel as cases rise across the... April 3rd? Weeks had gone by, and I had spent them detached from reality, a prisoner of my own mind. In other news, it's been rumored that washing your hands 3 times to the tune of Happy Birthday is enough to... The voice on the radio cut off, and I swallowed a shriek building in my non-existent throat. Happy birthday, I thought. Did it calm people? Could I use it as an anchor? That's enough of that. Professor Quincy's voice was like a wave of ice-cold water, startling me. I apologize if the radio is distracting folks. I'm just prepping Subject A. Just give me a moment and I'll be with you. If you're curious about this vital procedure, please go to the About page of my website. I could feel the tips of his fingers stroking my scalp, a protruding needle sticking into the back of my skull, warm wetness dripping down my back. And stop. I just wanted it all to stop. I wanted to fail. Plunge. I wanted to go home. I was reminded of a memory of myself struggling with a rabbit, trying to drill into its head. Karma. My body relaxed when the professor's fingers slipped inside my skull. I didn't have a mouth to scream with. I was awake, I thought. I shouldn't have been awake mid-procedure. I must have made some kind of inclination, my body rattling from the agony racking my head, before Professor Quincy's voice slipped effortlessly into my ears, and I felt hatred. His touch leaves me for a moment. I apologize, Ren. Professor Quincy's voice slipped into my ears, and I felt hatred. I felt like my body was burning. I was screaming into an abyss which held me down. I don't think I administered enough anesthetic. Please forgive me. His hands, still sticky with my blood, stroked through the bald patch in my hair and the deep, carnivorous hole inside my brain. I was aware of him speaking my colleague's name several times, but I couldn't question him. There was something being forced down my throat. Jem, I thought dizzily. What were they doing to him? Go to sleep, my professor cooed, returning to my side. Good girl. I did. fireworks coming to life in the backs of my eyes, when oblivion bled into consciousness and I was left to hang suspended in the dark. That was when I first saw it. It started like a tiny pinprick of light, but as time passed, it grew bigger, something I could comprehend. Intense pulsing energy I felt like I could reach and envelop in my hands, sizzling, crackling, and exploding while my body burned. Pieces of me coming apart, memories I had held onto drifting away, and a sense of losing myself. My name, everything I had been. And that light, that blinding blue light I didn't think possible, grew brighter until it swallowed me up. And that's the end of this part. I really hope you enjoyed this series. It looks like it's the last part of this series, but if there is another one, I will be sure to upload it. But let's close the book on this chapter and consider this one done. I really hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you enjoyed this series. If you did, let me know. Subscribe, comment, like all of the things that YouTubers beg you to do, because as if you haven't heard that stuff a million times in your life already, but it really does help to comment and like and stuff like that, I guess. It just lets YouTube know that this stuff isn't hot garbage, so I appreciate all of you who do that. And if you'd like to, you can support this channel on Patreon, where there's a couple little goodies like early access. I mean, who doesn't do early access, though? But outside of that, there's just a Discord you can come join. It's pretty fun, though. I think you'd like it. I don't think there's anything else to say, so I really appreciate you for listening. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.